There we go. And it is
Hello.
January, and we are approaching the rest of the year unfolding. And it has been cold. It's a little warmer here, gently approaching the year. It's already like born. It's raising its little sapling leaves up. But
You're at like halfway to an NPR voice, but not halfway.
yeah, I'm trying not to spook the new year, Jesse.
Yeah. Yeah, too late. Hi, everyone.
Hi everyone, Happy New Year.
Happy January. We have taken an unintended sabbatical since last July, which was our last episode. We are endeavoring to get back on the centaur of this show, which is applicable to the subject matter today in tangential flashing ways.
Yeah,
Sure.
little foreshadowing. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's so as to say, if my gallop and trot look funky today, it is merely just lack of practice, not lack of affection for you.
Dear listeners.
Today is, hi everyone, welcome to Radio Free Golgotha. This is a very semi-regular, mostly irregular podcast after all. And if it's your first time listening to us, thank you. And if you've come back, thank you even more.
You knew what you were getting into.
Yeah, exactly. This is an interesting episode. And one of the things that made us decide to, is it January, New Year, new Radio Free Golgotha? Unfortunately, it always seems that way, but that's just what happens because it is our 7th year anniversary. 7 years ago, we did an episode on the Three Kings to start off everything. And that still is a topic very near and dear to Al and yes to me as well, but I know it's a proficiency of yours. I think that in addition to our 7th year, we had planned this episode in celebration, commemoration of the 1-year anniversary of Jake Stratton-Kent's passing. And so for those that are listening today, our dead magician of the day is Jake. So normally we list him last, and I thought I was going to do that, but somehow organicism has won over, and we miss you, Jake. And so welcome to episode 30-something of Golgotha. Our Sesame Streeted, no trademark infringement intended. Our topics are: Saint of the day is Anthony of Egypt. The demon is Surlin. Plant or herb is hops. The stone is lodestone. The type of magic we decided to go with the Grimoire Verum. And perhaps grimoires in general, but Grimoire Verum is specific enough. The figure and the trump, we're going to acknowledge that we've talked about figures quite a bit, and trumps even, and perhaps do less basic education on those things or rehashing of introductory bullet points of those things, and more just let them color the episodes if they seem relevant. But Albus as the figure and its corresponding Odu, which is Oturupon, or Merinla of the Dilogun and Ifa, respectively, and our trump being the devil, and our dead magician, as aforementioned, being the full of piss and vinegar great magician and just a really damn sweet person, Jake Stratton-Kent.
Yeah, this is our first dead magician I think that we've both met, let alone been friends with, and so yeah, I'm very excited to celebrate Jake's work and reflect a little bit. I've been lucky enough to be part of a panel earlier this year for the Astromagia conference, which was kind of celebrating Jake's work, partly his astrological contributions, but also there's a bunch of people that knew him and loved him and still love him, and got to reflect a little bit on our favorite stories about him. So there'll be some reflection on our dear friend, but also an emphasis on like his work and ways that we can keep that alive and that it can be continued to be circulated and argued about in a constructive way, especially over a drink at the end of a conference, as Jake would love to do. So yeah, very excited to honor Jake in this very special episode.
Yeah, and for those, in addition to, I suppose, it being the 1-year anniversary of his passing. It's interesting to observe these traditional protocols, which are like to not speak too much of the dead, except at memorials as needed and things like that. But for a year or a year and a day or a certain amount of time has passed. And it's interesting to see that with Jake specifically, of the patterns there of what it is to speak of him a year later feels very different than speaking of him a week or two after his passing. So I guess that's something to examine as well. But
Yeah.
pleased to have the opportunity. So thanks, Al. And
Absolutely.
thank you, Anthony the Great, for having a great feast day today to start us off.
Mm-hmm. He's got some great AKAs. Like he's approaching like Wu-Tang level of like sobriquets and aliases, right? Anthony Egypt, Anthony of the Desert, Anthony the Anchorite, Anthony the Hermit. I guess some of these are a little themed. Anthony the Abbot, Anthony of Thebes, and indeed, as you say, Anthony the Great. He is not Anthony of Padua, right? He of the lost things found.
Yeah, and just the 1,000-year difference, but certainly there were other monastics before Anthony, but because of his biography, what was that, 4th century? The first one is in Greek, and then it's already like one of the more popular biographies at that time, and then it gets translated into Latin and becomes one of the classic works of literature. So it's golden legended before the golden legend is penned in that way. So
it's penned by Athanasius of Alexandria, right? Who it's only like 4 years after Anthony dies that this comes out. So rather than very often when we deal with this hagiography, it's someone writing a couple centuries later. This is a guy that he was one of his students, right? One of his little monks, or someone who was at least around in Anthony's lifetime.
Yeah, certainly as the story goes, and I think it's also there's spiritual tourism that's definitely happening at this time to use the promotion or the discussion of the asceticism and the quote unquote ideal Christian lifestyle that can you incorporate, being a desert father into your daily life. The average person cannot, right? So that there's a way that if you were to give up your life for Jesus, the way that you felt the best Christians were doing, you at least could live vicariously through this biography in a way and understand the kind of amazing, very supernatural descriptions of what had happened to him and his trials and tribulations and as things go. So I think that there's, in addition to inspiring the piousness of everyday people, and even this kind of religious escapism, perhaps, or fantasy life in a good way. I mean, I guess it's kind of great to imagine yourself to what would it be like if I was the type of person I wanted to be, or even just I don't have to be an ascetic because I understand what it's like, which is, we understand that type of incorporation of fiction into personal narrative, I suppose, there's a blurring line there that's interesting to explore within spirituality, especially. We did an episode on Mary of Egypt, who's the desert mother, and here is the desert father, and not a mated pair. Sorry, any neo-pagan cult forming out of them.
Not yet.
With that attitude. So, he's Egyptian. He's Lower Egypt. So he listens to the Gospel of Matthew. If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have, give to the poor, and you'll become treasures in heaven. So he gives away some of his family's land, sold the remaining property, and donated everything to the poor, and then left to live an ascetic life, and gave his sister to a bunch of virgin Christian ladies to protect. In choosing the monastic life, he also chose it for his sister, who, of course, at the time period would have been subject to whoever the male head of her family was. So he remains in the area. He was first the disciple of another hermit, and he worked with pigs a lot, during that time period, which is why one of his attributes is a pig, which there's lots of pseudo-iconographical and folklore, I suppose, in general, of comparing the driving of demons into pigs and things that Anthony of Egypt can help with. He certainly has this externalization of temptation and sin and meeting with fantastical beasts down in the biography as listed. But this I will wander into the desert alone kind of, Muad'Dib style, or at least God Emperor, is fascinating. And only eating bread and water and salt. And of course, bread does have protein in it in this ancient grain way. Constantly fasting, his greatest devils being boredom and laziness, and a little bit of lusties, which, is a big theme in his portrayal in Christian art throughout the centuries. Because he's such an early saint, he's inspired a lot of artwork because of the popularity of his biography. And so the Michelangelos and the wood etchings, I think but the temptations of St. Anthony that are there, ergotism is associated with him, right? St. Anthony's fire. And this, which is a wonderful connection to witchcraft as well in that way. But, lots of LSD and the people that are suffering from this and his healing of them from these diseases, which sounds like trip sitting, frankly. Like this person's going through a fit and it's like, well, just sit with them and tell them calming things and then just them. And I'm not trying to belittle the importance of that. I think that's actually really a lovely job of, no, you're having a bad trip. I'll help you out of it, man. We're good.
Yeah.
So I like to think of him, as many friends have in my lifetime, as the patron saint of sitters, allegedly, in taking substances in a forgotten past of my own. But,
someone who wasn't me anymore. Yeah.
7 years have passed. It's a different person. So there's a lot of lore around him. I mean, he's a wonderful saint to dive into his story. Please, I invite anyone to read the biography, become very versed in his life. I think the artwork speaks a lot for him, right? That there's, in addition to the fighting of the demons of boredom and laziness, he also has this encounter that's famous of, he goes out to find Paul of Thebes, who was, supposedly a better hermit than him. And that's kind of like the desire to go into the desert, right? And he finds on his way there, he's met by a satyr and a centaur. And many people have proposed that these are just demons, but the reality of these beings being real, that was a really reflexive sentence. The reality of these beings being real should be part and parcel for the time period in which this was written. And especially if we're going to go into like the hairy ones and the creatures of the desert that are biblically mentioned. It's kind of like if the Shedim are mentioned in the Bible, then we believe that it's literal or go towards a literal interpretation. It's kind of like how every devout Muslim must believe in the jinn, right? Because they're written. Right. So it's one of those things like, I'm sorry, the hairy ones, if they're satyrs, they're biblical. We're good. Right. The King James Version, unicorns are biblical too. But that he doesn't understand the language of the satyr, who's half horse, half man, and he had asked directions from him. I'm like, hey, do you know where Paul is? Because I'm looking for Paul. And Enter was like, and pointed to the way that he was supposed to go, and then ran and vanished from his sight. And people say, oh, it's a demon that's tempting him in the desert and trying to do all these things. So, the satyr is, I believe they put it, that's the mannequin, right? Mannequin with a hooked snout, a horned forehead, and extremities like a goat's feet. And he was peaceful and tried to offer him fruits. And Anthony asked who it was, and the satyr could speak and say, I'm mortal and one of those inhabitants of the desert whom the Gentiles worship under the names of fauns, satyrs, and incubi. I'm here on behalf of my tribe, and we pray you to entreat the favor of your God and ours, who we have learned came once to save. Like basically, like we're Christians too, and whose sound echoes throughout all the world, and we hear it. So Anthony is overjoyed by the satyr. The satyr basically saves him, like as a second, like, this is wonderful. Thank you. There's some meditations on this too, that like a centaur, if they're 2/3, right? Because they often have, front legs, back legs of a horse and the body of a man, that they're 2/3 animal, 1/3 man, and that they are, beastly nature is still the majority in a centaur, that somehow, yes, the satyr, their extremities are that of a goat, and sometimes up to the waist if we're trying to hide the fact that they may be naked. But the associations with lust, but they are at least half human and can reason and convert their lust into this worship and acceptance of Christ's message is fascinating.
Yeah. It's a take on demonizing, right? It says, no, they are real, but they're not gods. And some of them are even Christian now. That's a very different take from all your gods are just demons and we will destroy them and all your base are belong to us. Yeah.
And there does seem to be a conflation between the very importantly Egyptian and pre-Muslim Middle Eastern lore that we would now consider more Middle Eastern than Christian here. But the idea that there's ghouls that are eating the bodies of the dead, that he's around the tombs, and that there's demons in those tombs, that they're described in ways that we would recognize within jinn literature now. So there is an overflow here that he is going between the very real beasts and the unseen demons who are also taking on physical form, that are eating the dead, that are tormenting him, that he's meeting satyrs and centaurs, and that this is all his visions in the desert. It's also fascinating to see in artwork how it's really interesting when people have not truly seen deserts before. and also the portrayal, how we're not quite at full representational art yet, and so it's interesting to look back at the presentations of St. Anthony, where like it was not common to make a forest have a green ground, right? Like there was still deserty brown across the board. So wilderness was often depicted as a forest, regardless of whether or not it was a desert. It's one of those things of like, it's a wilderness. This is where beasts are. It's scary.
Yeah. This is fascinating on this. Yeah, wilderness, like how deserted is wilderness, right? Like on the one hand, you are going to be by yourself and struggle with the demons of boredom. But on the other hand, is deserted more a sense of a lack of civilization, in which case it can still be full of stuff. Forests are crowded places, right? So many different blades of grass and leaves and different trees and whatnot, alongside the idea that like you go to places where there aren't a lot of humans in order to talk to stuff that isn't human, right? Like going to the deserted crossroads or the ruins of old buildings in order to do it, A, undisturbed, B, without the church or secular authorities, castigating you as a witch or a necromancer or something. But also as like, that's where the spirits that aren't human hang out and are maybe at their more physical.
Yeah. When the demons beat him to death in one instance and his servant or disciple pulls him out of the cave, because he's beaten to death by the demons and they're mourning his death, and Anthony comes back to life and he recounts how he had seen a light at the end of the tunnel basically, and that he cried out to God like, why didn't you help me when I was getting beaten? And God's like, you were doing a good job, like now we're going to talk about how you survived, this is great. It's like the clockmaker God comes in and is like, why am I going to interfere? You're doing good job, man.
Yeah.
Like, good for you.
But did you die?
Yeah, but did you die? Like, are you alive? Like, what's the no harm, no foul type of thing.
When there were one set of footprints, you carried yourself with the feet I gave you.
Yeah, absolutely. And when there were 8 set of footprints, there was a centaur. So he's celebrated on January 17th in, yes, the Catholic and the Anglican and the Orthodox. So there's a lot going on here. He is revered in the Coptic Church heavily as well because it's an Egyptian saint. This is the Father of Monasticism and specifically of ascetics. He's an anchorite. He was an early influence on the Cenobites, which is just a wonderful, term to throw around in there. But people living in community, it's a much more innocuous term than perhaps is fun.
Than Clive Barker's got his lusty fangs into.
Absolutely. But there are some really lovely miracles associated with him. There's the meeting of when he finally meets Paul, the raven that brings them bread. There's this constant theme. Was it St. Pancras that we were talking about in the raven that brings meat? And the discussion of how meat is just food, and it really shattered my illusions.
Right. Elijah as well, while he's fleeing. Yeah. And even if it's bread, then that brings up old Benedict as well, and the raven that wouldn't until it was told to take the poisoned bread away.
Yeah. And so it's interesting too, because there's in the accounts and the way things go with this, Anthony is famous and people are coming to kind of watch him from a distance or to be inspired to Christianity. Constantine does know about him, and Paul of Thebes, who he went to go meet, and they do meet, of course. They have this relationship, and there's this big thing with cloaks because it's like one of their few possessions, right? So Anthony being sent to fetch the cloak given to him by Athanasius the bishop to bury Paul's body in. And then Paul dies before he's returned. And there's just all these things that are going on that they use this kind of name dropping thing too, that not saying it's made up, but it is a very helpful thing if you can refer to famous people that are in other narratives, like Paul exist outside of the recounting of St. Anthony's life.
Right. Crossover editions.
Yes, that allows the spin-off to happen and the way that goes. And that he does sense his own demise coming. And he gives his staff to one person and his sheepskin cloak to another and another sheepskin cloak, the second best, like Shakespeare to Anne, sheepskin cloak, and is buried in a grave next to his cell, which is, already laying the foundations of like the anchoritic tradition, which we touched base with Salome and Judith. Your current footsteps are over your future grave type of mentality of the anchorites. But most importantly is the temptation stuff. Like really, that's what you see. Yeah. And so I think there's a beautiful identification that I think many magicians have, especially of like, those memes that were like, what you think you're like.
Right. Like, what your mom thinks you do. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, getting up in the morning is, it should be like the reality of it is just that you need to have coffee, but everybody acting like they're St. Anthony being plagued by devils. And so I think there's quite a Dali, Leonard Carrington, Max Ernst, Hieronymus Bosch, Schongar, Krasbeck, these famous ones, Flaubert, all depicting the temptation of St. Anthony, just kind of walking off of a cliff, which is probably, other than Jesus being tempted in the desert during his Lenten excursion, is probably the most famous being tempted by demons artwork that you see.
Yeah. Yeah. The ones of them being fully like carried in the air, not just like someone over his shoulder, but like fully, torn apart by a host of bizarrely chimeraed bestial demons. Yeah, being carried through the air, being carried away, right, by demons, being carried away by the obsession with not being influenced by demons. There's a bunch of ways that genre of paintings have been interpreted and moralized from.
Yeah. So, he dies on Mount Colzim, which is his the inner mountain of St. Anthony, as it's called. And I think around the foothills of that is the oldest Coptic monastery still in existence. It was built in the 4th century. So it's reputedly the Christianity's oldest monastery. And that's about 150 kilometers southeast of Cairo. And, overlooks the Red Sea. So the mountains of the Red Sea. So there's something beautifully tied to the land there. I've seen essays on him kind of focusing on what it's like to re-indigenize and have a relationship with the land.
Oh, interesting.
And
from like a kind of rewilding perspective.
Yeah. In a very Christian monastic way, and that because monasteries are actually very rare. Abbeys are very rare. To be a self-contained, ideally place where you are making a living off of the land in a self-sustaining way. And why would this be even rarer in modern times? Is because no one wants to do that labor. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to have a convent of nuns. It's another thing to say these nuns are growing their own food, slaughtering their own animals and things like that. And it's one of those, the Abbey in Connecticut is such a special place for that. But to have this relationship with like the land is the thing that you live by. Is a different breed of Christianity than the city cathedrals. So, if your entire livelihood is bent upon you still have to get up and go work in the garden or you're not going to eat later, there's a very different reality there than having servants and everything is given to you in the kind of temple priesthood that was inherited from pagan times, right? There's people give you the offerings and you live off of them as opposed to you're growing them. So I think there is a lovely romanticization that can happen and an understanding, as you point out, like a rewilding or a re-enchantment that can happen with St. Anthony.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, assessing, like you said at the top, when the desert is the desert of the escape we would like to. Oh, I'm going to, ditch all this emails and go and learn mud and stick language, right? That impulse and assessing what that is versus the reality of, I think we quipped about that, right? The difference between knowing that the 10,000 years of agriculture have been about subsistence farming being very, very difficult, right? And like on the one hand, the cottagecore ideals look really appealing to our complicated and potentially overstimulated modern or postmodern existence, but also a lot of our ancestors worked damn hard to not have to do that.
Yeah, it's funny how much it was a 90s flashback there of just the desert of the real, right? Of and Baggio coming down and like the Matrix and whew, okay, I'm not crying, you're crying. Yeah, oh, Baggio. Okay, so in this plaguing of demons, plaguing by demons, and certainly I think, wow, I got British for a second. The plaguing by boredom and laziness and horniness as main, difficulties with your monastic ideals is something that every magician probably identifies with. But I guess, without staying too long on Anthony, if he's the hinge pin of or the start of this monastic impulse, or the one who really kind of defines and the popular, not the founder necessarily in truth, but the founder in myth, and therefore, this is where truth with a capital T surpasses historical truth in that way. I think I'm trying to build a bridge to Serlin here, and I will cede heavily and put the onus upon you for Serlin, just because I know that you have a much more you have not only a contextual understanding but a more working understanding of Serlin, who ostensibly until Jake's work was not well known and not used, and certainly if there's one demon I would want to associate with Jake, it might end up being Serlin because of the prominence to which he made Serlin rise to. I don't know if that is that fair to...
I think so, yeah. I think absolutely, yeah. I would say an extra bridge is that Serlin or Sirac or a number of the other derivations of spirits similar, the complexity of looking at that spirit hinges on their role as an intermediary in the Grimorium Verum. And I would say there is something in the sense of retiring from civilization, but realizing you are still, a desert is not a blank slate. It still has an ecology. It still has its centaurs and its fauns. And one of the things that looking at Skurlin's role as an intermediary is not just about fast tracking your magic, or by contrast, stacking so many intermediary spirits in between you and what you're trying to do, but that you are entering, that the grimoires aren't just about a hierarchy of who is bigger and can beat each other up, but that they chart interrelationalities between spirits and the sense of a set of communities of spirits who hang out together, who have disagreements, who have overlap in what they do. And so that's where I'd start, is that Skurlin has this intermediary spirit and introduces us to the other spirits. And indeed, it might not be, I don't want to say possible, but it doesn't seem advised by the Grimorium Verum to try and contact spirits without him, right? It's said he is very potent to render you service and cause you to have power over other spirits, but it said it's Skurlin who bringeth all others to your conversation. So that's the kind of starting role here. In terms of practicality of what we know about how the spirit works in the Grimorium Verum, that we've also conveniently made our magic genre of the episode.
So it's like we're in charge of the lottery itself.
Imagine, yeah, we're just like, oh, you set yourself up so many things. Yeah, so practically speaking, working with the Grimorium Verum and working with the explicit pact making of its operating system, the character of Skurlin, its seal or sigil, is the first thing put on the pact document, the parchment that is your pact itself. It's blooded by the little finger specifically. You're meant to wind a virgin thread around the finger and then prick it with a consecrated lancet. And that blood is used to draw his character, or is added to ink and draw his character. There's a dedicated conjuration, which starts Hiloi Tau Varath, which is said to cause the intermediary Skurlin to come. And from there, you add in the other characters and conjurations of the other spirits you're trying to pact with in this formal procedure. They're said to be close to Lucifer, bestowed with some of his authority, not just as the Verum divides up the world between the three chiefs of hell, the triumvirate of the underworld. But Lucifer is in this case not just in charge of Europe and Asia, but is the primus inter pares, is the first amongst equals of the chiefs, and so can command potentially any spirit, but does that through Lucifer and this kind of meta role through the pacting process. Now, the other thing to say about Skurlin, on the one hand, it's very concrete what Skurlin does, like a central part of the formal pacting procedures, and is also present in some ways in some of the implicit pacts, the supernatural secrets, the specific spells that send these spirits out, as opposed to the explicit pact of like, now we are in a gang together and I've got you on speed dial. And those are a set of ongoing kind of explorations from a variety of Verum practitioners about other intermediary spirits. The big one that I've already mentioned is Sirak or Siraki or Skyrak or a couple of other ones. Some readings suggest that Skurlin is the general intermediary of all those spirits in the Verum, or specifically is the intermediary between the three chiefs and the 6 deputies, whereas it's said that Sirak has the 18 subordinates. So it might be that, and certainly you can read from the text and work in a very effective way, that Skurlin faces up the hierarchy, if you want to put it like that, and Sirak faces down at the 18 spirits like Klaunek and Bechau that rule particular things, these subordinates. Now, that's slightly complicated by the fact that in the 16th century grimoire that the Grimorium Verum is very clearly based on, the Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, or the Clavicula Solomonis Secretum Secretorum, Duke Sirak is the first deputy of Lucifer. So rather than having this floating role either over the 18 deputies below, or kind of like floating throughout the whole hierarchy and there to connect up any call to anyone else, they're a specific deputy. And this is one of the many reasons that we've touched on before when we've talked about Verum hierarchy, or even with counterparts or some of the manuscript sources that informed the flow of the spirit arrangements in some forms of Kimbanda, that between manuscripts there's a lot of difference in exactly who is a deputy and who's under which chief. And that's partly because in some of the older ones, Sirak is the first deputy of Lucifer, whereas later on that becomes Satanakia or Put Satanakia. And so there's this, it's not the only confusion. We've talked a little bit about how Agliarept appears to be Agliarept or Kairak, and might be 2 spirits that were elided, or might be 1 spirit that got split by a clerical error and is now two spirits. So that's an added layer of if this spirit started as a deputy and then kind of got a sort of promotion to being a general intermediary. The other aspects of that, when it makes the clearest sense, are around, there's some debate about how the deputies and the subordinates actually interact with each other and how closely they are divided up is one way we put it. And when I say debate, I don't mean like everyone's scratching their heads and no one can make this thing work. I've talked to a variety of people, I'm confident, have made a practice concordant with the text's instructions and supported by their own spirit work and divination. The big thing here with the deputies and subordinates is whether or not the 18 under Duke Sirac are divided into triads under the deputies. So do all 6 deputies rule all 18 subordinates, or like the Grand Grimoire, are the first 3 spirits, Clowneck and Beckhoud and Masusin, are they under the first deputy and the second 3 are under the second deputy, etc. And that's the guild structure that I've found very helpful, and that I talked to Jake about, and Jake would post in responses to people going through some of those old threads is great on the Facebooks and elsewhere in some of those grimoire groups, and pointing out that while this division of the 18 subordinates into like guilds of 3 under each particular deputy isn't explicit in the Verum, it does seem to work. And they seem happy with it. I've found it fruitful to work in this guild structure because, the practices aren't set in stone. They're living practices that emerge from a development. As we've said before, a grimoire is a snapshot of spirits operating across human time and space, right? They're the experience of that practitioner and how they work. So there's that end of like, where is Skirlin or Sirac in this? And there's a particular supernatural secret, a particular operation to cause lightning, which demonstrates some of this working practice and why you would bother dividing up the 18 subordinates by the 6 deputies. The operation to cause lightning employs 3 sigils of spirits. It employs the seal or sigil of Lucifer, of Sirac, and of Beckhoud. Now, this makes sense why you would use that subordinate. Beckhoud is the spirit of the winds and indeed all weather conditions. The connections between Lucifer and lightning make sense. And then, therefore, also to include Sirac either as a general intermediary or as the specific deputy in charge of Beckhoud also makes sense to me. So I think this approach is, if not explicitly taught, does seem to be supported by the traditions that are in place. Having banged on a lot about intermediaries, the other 2 I wanted to bring up were the Spirit of the East, who is mentioned at the start of the Grimorium Verum. Sometimes in some other manuscripts that's pluralized and is Spirits of the East, but when it's singular, it's usually capitalized. And it was Jake that put forward that this is, if not actually Oriens, at least a link to spirits in Oriens' court. So again, this links the Verum to deeper necromantic organization with the 4 kings of the cardinal directions, Oriens, Paimon, Amaimon, and Egin, sometimes Araton. But also that Oriens, like Lucifer, has a kind of first amongst equals role, that like linking to Skirlin, which you make offering to Skirlin of frankincense wetted with your own blood when you make the first character, the kind of initial Laman that you need to work this stuff. And so again, we have this link back to, let me offer something to a big spirit that I can potentially work with the spirits that gather, under their skirts kind of thing. The one other set of intermediaries, the comparable intermediary role of Skirlin and other spirits in the wider Grimoire corpus, is with Tanta Valerian, a spirit found in the Folger Book of Offices, as well as Emu's Manuscript 173, which was published relatively recently by Dan Harms as Of Angels, Demons, and Spirits. And in that, it's said that although Lucifer is the father of all devils, he may not necessarily be called, for he is in the depths of hell, yet by him, as by Tanta Valerian, other devils may be conjured and bound. And especially significant for for this podcast, some of the aliases of Tanta Valerian might include Dantalion later down the line, maybe. He's an addition to the 72 of the Lesser Key, which might suggest he was floating around without a set position in the hierarchy because he was an intermediary spirit. That's a possibility. But the other names that are definitely also Tanta Valerian are Canta Valerian and Golgothel, or Golgothiel. Interestingly. So there's this connection back to the place of the skull. Yeah, and that Adamic thing also raises another aspect of how engaging with these spirits and their histories of chasing them across the paper trail of the Grimoire corpus also shows that we can, in some cases, reconnect old stuff. And in some cases, we can go anew. So recent grimoire studies have been showing that the large diamond character of Skirlin that's in Jake's True Grimoire and is in,
It's a vagina.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A lovely Vesica, a vagina Pisces. There's yeah, it's pronounced Rahanya. Yeah. In the older Verum, in the newer Verum versions, the 18th century onwards, there is lettering around the Vahine of the center of the diamond, which spells out ADAM. Right, as many folks will know, I have a deep soft spot for the First Father and Adamical magics and lettering and speaking. And it's said that you remove 2 of those letters and you add in your own initials. So you're literally like signing your name in a pact, right? It's been shown pretty definitively now that the earlier manuscripts, it's a corruption of Adonai around the edge. But I personally really like this Adamic reformulation. And when I used it as a springboard to bring in other Adamic stuff, those spirits were very valent to that. And I think this just raises some interesting issues around corruption versus mutation, adaptation, reformulation in grimoires. These practices might come from are grounded in a particular historical context and a magical framework of understanding, but the spirits themselves are not frozen in amber. And just as they can receive promotions, again, Jake was very interested in looking at the doctrines of restitutionism that say, this is a fallen angel who doesn't like being in hell and entertains one day getting back into heaven, but also this idea that like spirits can change their functions, that these aren't problems necessarily. They're examples of the varied way that these folk practices have happened. Yeah.
It's interesting too. I mean, the Adonai to Adam thing, it's not hard to make the stretch without, falling into, what older automatically equals better. And, the Mahler quote, I posted it on Jason's wall recently, but because it's the Gustav Mahler quote, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire, except in German.
Yes.
But this is an important part of that too. And it's also not a stretch that if you were working with and you were trying to understand Adonai, Adonai, however you're going to pronounce this permutation of it. Who is the first child that is there? I mean, Adonai is daddy god to Adam. I have seen a lot of permutation, experimentation, and attribution to Serlin that is obviously inspired by Jake's work and his writings and permutations that go on that to people saying that Serlin is the patron of the kind of empty skull that can be kept in witches or magicians' courts of the thing that allows the spirit to come in to something. And therefore, if you're talking about that, then of course the stretch is going to be to Adam and a Golgothiel type of spirit, because, using the bones of first daddy to call upon, Sky Daddy kind of makes sense, or to call on anything that is out there. I mean, that is a really lovely, easy thing to think. I have seen everything from, I know there is a prominent dude in Veracruz that I know in that kind of weird, lovely showmanship of black magic that is Veracruz in Mexico. But try and find the picture because I keep on meaning to send it to you and I keep on losing it, where it's offering a goat to Serlin and then drying the skin and sewing the parchment over the skull itself of the goat. That being the pact thing in that way. But it's also all this to say, as much as the Grimoire Verum was out there, it was not something that was popularly in the Anglosphere's attention until Jake.
No. Absolute character assassination by Arthur Waite, etc. Of this, terrible book of black magic that was that combination that nigromancy seems to have had since at least the 4th century of like, it's wrong and it's bad and it's fraudulent and it's evil. Like, which is it? Is it fake or is it dangerous? Like,
it can be both. Generally, the assertion that the Grimoire Verum, because this is the easiest transition ever, is, the grimoires with maintaining their pagan roots as opposed to too strong an overlay of Christianity, which it's impossible to not have some overlay of Christianity, even within medieval Jewish grimoires. I mean, we see it because it's the predominant culture of Europe and the written language in that way. And also frames what we think a notebook of magic should look like, that it should be this organized system. Like the key, you're like, I'm sorry, wait, that makes no sense. Like we both have seen each other's notes. They are not organized.
Looking at working books of pre-modern cunning folk and seeing that like the conjuration like goes over 2 pages and is split between like, I just needs to write down this recipe in between those things. It's as it comes to you. There's no cut and paste at this point.
That's your student's job after you die. Figure this out later.
Make me
I know
look
what it's
good.
like. It's kind of like bringing someone into your library and you're organized. I think your library, my library has always been so, it's just added to. And I'm like, I think it's a red book. It's on the third shelf from the top. And if somebody moves it, God help them. Like, I don't need to have an organization system because that's not true. I'm just saying the ego kicks in of like, I don't need myself to be organized more than I am. I'm either going to remember or I'm not. You who want to learn something need it to be organized. So,
Yeah.
it's the same with all languages. The more organized something is, the more new it is in many ways.
Yeah.
The Grimoire has risen to popularity because it feels like it gave people in the 90s. The joke was, if there's this thing that Crowley said that, he was promised the mysteries of the universe when he joined the Golden Dawn, and all he got was the Hebrew letters, or I don't even think that's Crowley. It's the quote that's misattributed to Crowley, but has been said many times that all they got were the Hebrew letters. That there's something to this, that you were looking for paganism and all you got was ceremonial magic in the 90s, of like the pagan book of rituals is nothing but grimoire spells. And Grimoire seemed to be an answer to that for many people, I think, in looking at that it was a different flavor of grimoire.
Yeah.
And I'm also very curious as to why Lucio Fontanelle in Brazil, in writing his book Eshu, which is, we're talking 50s, 60s Brazil, chooses the Grimoire Verum as the syncretization point for the Eshus and specifically the Eshus and one Pombagira, collectively known as Pombagira, of what had been called Kimbanda at that time. Is it something that was pre-existing? Did Fontenelle write this so that he could write a book? Is it out of, like, a lot of people now credited him like he invented it. He wrote it down and it's published, and that influenced from there. But certainly I don't think it's out of the ether. His exact descriptions to spirits and how they are, when we write anything down for the first time and publish it, it creates a canon. But it's such an interesting thing that is the grimoire that was chosen as the corresponding lists for the organization of Eshus and Kimbanda. Yeah. Given that we know that there is a ceremonial and even a thelemic influence in Brazil early on, but that is something that is still fascinating for me to look at. There's a lot of myth and things that go with that through the 70s and 80s, and then as the 70s take over and the kind of re-Africanization of many traditions in Brazil happens, then the 90s comes back in, and academia is putting kind of like, hey, there's actually tons of roots here and we're complicating it. And then you get to the 2000s and there's research, and now there's Jake and there's all these other things going on. And certainly Jake looked to Kimbanda as a way to be inspired to work within the Grimoire Verum's catalog of spirits. Yeah. And, I assume, because we're already talking about it, so there's going to be these things that we're kind of going back and forth. But it's fascinating that in a tribute to Jake, I radically disagreed with him about a lot of things. And at the same time, he was the happiest person to hear any disagreements. So like anytime I see someone bemoan him online and go off, he loved being proven wrong. He loved it. Because it was like, let's go get a drink and let's like yell at me, please, for 4 hours type of thing. And then he changed his mind constantly, and would quote it like, if a spirit can go from hell to heaven, like certainly Jake can go from, he just wanted to chat, and his kind of, blow it all up tank girl attitude.
Right, exactly. Yeah, not an addiction to arguing for itself, but that method could produce useful perspectives for all parties. But it's worth having some friction, and what's the alchemical fire we can guard from that friction that cooks us dinner.
There's a thing that happens in acting that's very common, and I'm sure there's parallels that people will recognize. But when you're given notes or corrections by a director, and there's often a defense that kicks in where the person's like, well, I was doing that. Well, obviously, if the director's giving you that note, they want to see more of it, and they're not seeing what they want to see. And occasionally, when you see it happen, because we don't have models for it, it's very rare that you'll see someone without defense just take notes, say, okay, great, and incorporate it right away. And it's off-putting. Because you're like, how did that? What?
I was ready to fight you some more.
Yeah, and Jake reminds me of that. I remember the first time meeting him in Cornwall, and he was like, "I'm so excited to meet you." I was like, "Oh, I've been a little bit nervous." He goes, "Why?" I was like, "Because I have a lot of issues with certain things he said." He's like, "Oh, fantastic." And it was like, "What are you doing in an hour?" And Jake had no defense. He had defense in the sense that he would bring things up, but never with an ego attachment to them.
Right.
And that was fascinating. was
Yeah.
it was as if I was watching an actor incorporate notes with no ego defense.
Hmm.
And it's lovely. And for me, that Ingress was the merging between this forced syncretism between a Kimbanda that I knew had, for me, and the way that I know it and my lineage has a lot of African roots, with this overlay of syncretism and cultural syncretism. But there are Kimbandas that have heavy ceremonial roots with an overlay of the African, and they're kind of everybody's paying these different services around. But he was very just open about it. So I put that out there. Like, thank you, Jake, for that lesson in grace, because it was, I've not seen it often.
Hmm.
Even amongst those of us that are friends, it's not easy to have no defense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so whatever that is, thank you for that, Jake. Is there anything that you feel is important on reflecting on the Grimorium Verum, just as to its importance? Or, I mean, obviously we're touting Jake's kind of Serlinism of it, but anything salient that's worth mentioning?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think that two of the strengths and possibly even the reasons for its historical adoption by various peoples has been, on the one hand, this idea of it being a more pagan, or a grimoire that preserves more of the pagan approaches, is partly down to its denigration, as like literally blackening, as like, oh, this is the worst of black magics, and a bunch of magicians that have not felt that their experiences of the church have been nurturing or a thing that they can get on board with, kind of jumped on that as like, okay, let's that classic thing, if the church has colonized us, let's make friends with this devil that they seem so angry about, that seems interested in feeding people and disrupting mechanisms of control. So I think there's that aspect of it, but I think the other aspect is just the practicality of the Grimorium Verum. It has a concrete starting place, which not all grimoires do. They'll list like the tools you need, but there won't necessarily be a sense of like, can you work out which you need first, or do you need all of them before you do anything? Verum has the first character we talked about with Serlin. It gets called a Laman in the Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, but it is very much, it's not the pact bundle, it's the thing you do to signal that you are starting work, and it contains a character that, again, you sign your initials into, and in many instructions the other side of it contains the spirits that you are planning on pacting with. So there's a sense of like where you begin. There's a variety of alternative approaches. The key one for a start, that you can work explicit pacts of like the formal procedure of joining the gang of some of these spirits, and then being able to call them with less of the formality, and then send them out to do things, as well as the implicit pacts of the spellcrafts of the supernatural secrets. And they themselves have a grammar that makes sense for their adaptation as well. You can see the moving parts of, there is a small circle that is drawn on an altar or on the floor, not big enough to stand in, but big enough to do the work in which sigils of spirits get put, sympathetic materials get put, the bucket of water to make it rain, or the skin of a chameleon to go invisible. In fact, Jake's adaptation of the Skirlin skull you mentioned is itself an adaptation of a supernatural secret operation of Morael, one of the spirits of invisibility. So he was taking a grammar that was already there and showing, we can see like the operations for using nails to do a death curse has a couple different variant cast across manuscripts. It's generally Frimost and another couple of others, but the spirits can be substituted out, right? Like that this is consistent with the grammar of the thing. There are also plenty of options, both for explicit and implicit pacts, of like how you do it. The Verum takes you through how to slaughter a goat and skin it and tan that hide into vellum, into parchment that you can then write your pact on. This was one of the central bases for Jake exploring through his Encyclopedia Goetica, specifically the 2 volumes of Gia Sophia, this idea of like this winning of this hide in order to write your pact on. He likened to the Argonauts pursuing the Golden Fleece. And so was able to connect up all of this older Hellenistic and Greco-Egyptian paganism and practice and techniques from this central operating thing. But the Verum also says like, oh, if you don't want to kill a goat, you can just get new parchment. And again, at what point is it just practical? And at what point is it also part of the protocols that you must observe for these spirits to grant you authority to work with them and command them, right? Like Jake was always a big fan of saying the process of preparing the skin if you aren't familiar with tanning, as I wasn't when I first read it, I was like, I have to get river stones. I have to get like a hazel knife. I have to get all this extra stuff. There's a liming pot. And these are all the standard things you do to turn goat skin into something you can write on, right? Yeah. They're not just weird stuff spirits want you to do. The river stones are river stones because they're smooth. They've been smoothed by the river. And so you can weight the skin down when you're stretching it without the risk of these sharp rocks cutting it. The hazel knife is sharp, but it's not sharp enough to cut it. It's once the thing's been slaked in lime, you scrape the hairs off with it. Like these are practical as well. And so his argument was you can utilize the parchment, as it says in the book, you can, as an alternative to slaughtering a goat. But he would always advise that you still weighted it down with the stones. You still treated it as if you'd acquired it from that process, that you still scattered the salt that had benediction said over it on it. You still put it in the liming pot as the place where you keep your sacred parchment that you use for your pacts. And so there are these options contained in it, that there's a great degree of flexibility with the system as well, whether we're talking about the way that the prayer of success, that technically you say 4 times a day in the build up to your conjurations, but also just becomes a Swiss Army knife of spirits that help you do the thing you're trying to do, that you can use it for a variety of things. That while the consecrations of the tools and the ways of doing things have a set grammar to them, asperging, then fumigating, then the 7 penitential psalms, then the Dalame conjuration of the tool guarding angels over it. Like you do that for everything, but the horizon of the instruments is said over any tools you have on an altar, which means like you can absolutely consecrate like tools that aren't in the core text, right? That might be useful. Jake was a big fan of like, this grimoire shows like the importance of having containers for your material, of what to do with it, of how to look after it, how to work with it, not just take the blood of a gopher and, and do so-and-so with it. Like there's a sense of like how like, again, the practicalities of like, what kind of vessel does this need to be kept in? And those kinds of things. And the idea of like, being able to consecrate like a mechanical engraving device, right, with this same horizon that it says can be used for any instrument, that you can put them all on an altar and do them together. But there's this flexibility with these, the horizons and prayers and so on. Yeah, that the tools themselves, uncommonly amongst the grimoire corpus, are not just decorated with divine names of God, like Agla on the blade, but are inscribed, painted, or engraved with the sigils of certain spirits, that the wands aren't just the hazel wand and the elder wand, but are inscribed with the sigils of Klepoth and Frimost. And that's always struck me as, it's a little bit unique. The liming pot has the sigils of Guland and Sergat on them, that there's a sense that you are hand in hand with the spirit when you are wielding this tool. That's always really appealed to me, along with the fact that, a lot of the preamble, a lot of the letter by Solomon to his son Rehoboam in the beginning of the Verum is about, you can work with elementals with this stuff. This teaches how these are spirits of Infernus, but also the land and the sea and the air. So like, again, the pagan roots aren't just all implicit or, you require a lot of squinting at. They also show that you are often working a little more collaboratively. I wouldn't go so far as say it's a quote spirit friendly grimoire. There's still a sense of like, some of these spirits are mean and you're going to need to give as good as you get. Don't get pushed around. But it's also not as outright antagonistic all the time. There's a sense of like collaborating and trying to find mutually beneficial solutions. There are sacrifices of incense made, and ideally you are addressing them with a mixture of praising them for how powerful they are and also saying, I'm not going to be pushed around by you. And this is also, part and parcel of Jake talking about being not a reconstructionist, but as he quips sometimes, a very late pagan, right? That these were his modern spirits for his modern practice, and that for him, these spirits played the part of his, not just his gods, but subjectively speaking, the gods.
I know, because you're talking about something that tickles my brain too, of the incorporation of, or the realization of our spirits as part and parcel of everyday activity, as opposed to something that is engaged with in a separate way.
Yeah.
One of the hallmarks of, for me, what is traditional witchcraft, of that, there are spirits of the hinge and the doorway, and this, we see this heavily evident, obviously, in Roman paganism, which has minor gods for everything, but the cult of the house kind of gets erased in favor of this very blanket Christian familiarism that does happen later, right? And that, patron saints of the household and things like that get paid attention to. But the idea that one can look at a pantheon of spirits and determine any action that must take place in daily life is under the protection or the guidance of one or more of them. And
Yeah. Yeah.
for me, it's the mapping of the sacred, of
Hmm.
the sacred landscape that is incredibly important. Not just that, like, that local mountain is an expression of Kaf or of, the holy mountain, but that the high point of my house is also an expression of that, and therefore is connected to the North Star, and therefore is connected to, is a portal to hell as well, or that the beams of the house have connections to certain constellations or stellar matters going on, and this. So I very much, what that turns into is a spin that I think is important too for understanding, having read in preparation for today, the little bits of preparation that we sometimes do, to see the Museum of Witchcraft, their exhibition that at least 4 items went to them, which was an offering plate and then spirit vessels for, was it Ashtaroth, Aglirept, and I don't know, somebody else.
Yeah.
But
Hmm.
these things are interesting that they also distinctly describe him as full necromancer, Jake Stratton-Kent, which is interesting because I'm not going to say you invented the term, but it's kind of one of those things that I didn't hear anybody use that term before you, and I know it's one that I'm not trying to start that fight, but it's a really lovely contribution even to the relationship to identify what that is, that in making necromancy folk, which is a big theme in our own exploration of
Yeah.
this podcast, of the folk necromancy forum on Facebook, and even the Speakeasy of the Dead, and how we relate, that the idea here is to take the systems and the magic and the grimoires and whatever we're studying and actually, well, I would argue queer them, but not just to play on the metaphor of queer as folk, but like to incorporate them into a daily understanding and an embodied life. That it is, this is the breathing into the clay idol that makes the golem of our practice.
Yeah,
And
and this is really core in the way I think Jake championed so heavily, working one grimoire as a foundation and fundamental basis. And I think sometimes that can be misinterpreted as saying my grimoire is better than your grimoire. I think what he was getting at was like, I have a basis to go to. Like you said, like somewhere in this book is going to be the spirit that I can work with for any matter I deal with, right? That you have this basis of, like we talk about with folk magic, like taking what little you have seriously and seeing how, not how far you can push it till it breaks, but like how can you rely on the work you've already done and learn new things and develop your understanding without shopping around for a grimoire that has some new shiny things in it, right?
yeah, it's similar to anything that we are picking up and actually utilizing. We will have an association, a world of associations that comes to support that, justify it, prove the exceptions, and otherwise. It's like in dealing with the figures, right? That there's some basic things to understand the figures, but it's important even in the contributions of people fading, like, no, actually, I see it like this. Like, as long as we can see where the train of thought is, like, who the fuck cares?
Yeah.
Things are that different.
Yeah,
But
the figures are big enough to contain a variety of explanations. They already do. That's why we have to be careful about the phrasing of questions,
yes.
right? Like, because they already can tell you the difference between will this disease get worse versus will my health improve?
Yes, and again, this folking of things to take, and this is because I have seen, and I don't think it's necessarily a false comparison, except that Jake himself was very honest about it, that comparing like Jake's interpretation and permutations upon the Grimoire Verum and its contextualized research for him is, that it could be almost like a Gravesian Celtic tree calendar if you're not careful. That and Jake himself was very against the status, the calcification and ossification of his words as gospel in any shape or form. And often, was like, oh, that part of it is wrong. And, or I think differently now. And it's like that, again, tribute to a pliable mind in that way. And love that part of the conversing for him. Like oftentimes when you're talking with someone and what we assume that, okay, I'm right about this, he would be happy to talk to you for the next 4 hours as if you're right about it. And then be like, I still think I disagree on this one point, but like, the only other problem with, I'm sure we'll come back to him in many forms and the Grimoire Verum, but the sheer amount of beer tolerance that is necessary to carry a conversation on with any of you that are British by birth. My Hobbit blood is not strong enough for this. But yeah, so somewhere there's a flashing segue into hops in there. But I think the Grimoire Verum and it's necessarily being the quintessential folk grimoire in the sense that, like, especially just in the modern, I specifically mean in the last 2 decades of being this exemplification of what it can be to live a grimoire fully without being the quote unquote highfalutin ceremonial magic of waits and mathers.
Right. Let's be honest, the colonialism undergirding a lot of the culture that, you know, those Golden Dawners were coming from. Yeah, and showing that this appreciation of its folkloric essence isn't a trend that people are hopping on. It's you know, showing that work with elementals, with dryads, with nature spirits, with these folkloric spirits is grimoiric. That this is a very traditional approach. The idea that like grimoire magicians only work with, you know, huge, large ritual furniture and only work with the highest of angels or the darkest of demons, you know, has a shallow history. And again, Jake's spearheading a renewed interest in Paracelsian magic, coined Albertine for, you know, looking at the secrets of Albertus Magnus, as well as Cyprianic traditions, both in Iberia and also in the English, in the Anglosphere grimoire corpus. Like, again, show that grimoire magic was folk magic before it was high ceremonial.
Yeah.
Whether or not we're going back to archaic Greece with that, or talking about like working today with you know, in where you are and what you have around you. Yeah.
Following exactly what we said before, the more organized something is, that's the student or the ones down the line that are trying to make sense of a teacher's notes that they can no longer talk to.
Yeah. People are messy. Life is messy. Folk magic is varied. And if you find a spell that has 12 different variants, that's a sign that a lot of people were using it. It's not a sign that it's corrupted necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in the oral studies, the orality examination, this is proof of this all the time, right? The more variants there are of something, the more like, well, it's obviously popular. This is actually proving how important it is, not taking away from how important it is. And also within oral cultures, such derivations are, while it can be used to be like we are the ones that have the real way, it is often just, this is how we do it and it works. If you want to use that version of it, go over to those people and do it over there.
This consistent thing of folk magic, on the one hand, appealing to a homogenized wisdom of the ancients, but it's not an appeal to the wisdom of the ancients. It's the provenance of the practice. People have been doing Sivan shears, as everyone that did Sivan shears says, since Theocritus, but we do this specific version of it. Like, that sense that like we own our version, but we acknowledge that like it's been done by folk, funnily enough, for a very long time. And that's less about, I think, an appeal to trying to justify it, so much as it is saying you should be primed that if you go 20 miles down the road, they're going to do Sivan shears a different way. And that's okay.
Yeah, I think all of that's really beautiful. It's in the same way that in a healthy world, you know, there's even a trace of that in, and again, I'm emphasizing the healthy, but academia, right? Of like, what are your schools of thought? Like, what are you trained in? What's the grounding for your style of debate?
Yeah.
And, you know, not only the university, but your mentors and who their mentors were, and that lineage of thought is one of those things that in all of these arguments is like, what are we predicating this particular invocation on, and how are we doing it? So it's interesting to see that, and I think the Verum is a really interesting example of perhaps more integrated into people's lives from the influence of one person and people like yourself adding to that body of knowledge and study of people genuinely, at least at first, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but there was just a genuine interest in promoting and experimenting and seeing what it was, as opposed to trying to prove everybody wrong.
Yeah.
By the time it got more public, perhaps, and you know, we're a couple of years out, and you see the same thing that we always see of, you know, people saying that they've always been working with the book. You're like, no, you haven't. There's no way. You have no knowledge of it until, you know, 2 months ago when you said, oh, I found this book and I really love it, and now somehow you've been doing the Grimoire and Verum for 8 years.
Right. Your grandmother must have been super psychic if she could predict working with a book that wasn't published yet, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. But I think the opposite is absolutely true, that like, you know, Jake inspired so many of us in his, you know, in his collegiate friendship and his like compassionate rabble rousing to continue to explore this stuff in a variety of directions, you know. Shout out to all sorts of different colleagues of mine working with Verum, you know, Matt Hadfield exploring the depths of where Four Kings can come in as an organizational principle for your whole practice. You know, a bunch of folks doing really great work from having talked over this stuff with Jake, how valent he was, how excited he was to share stuff with other people that were doing something, and to, you know, excite people who were still, you know, approaching something or thinking about it from an abstract perspective, to like get some dirt under the fingernails, get your fingers burned, as he used to say, you know? I think that's a real testament to his passion, to what he got out of that work and how he helped other people explore and support each other as well, as great modeling of what it means to refuse a guru role and instead talk about like what works. And yeah, we're very lucky.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to come back many times, but again, thank you, Jake, for all of that. Hops and lodestone are herb and stone, and I'm sure there's a way to kind of incorporate them into all of this. And lodestone is an easy one, right? Because lodestone is, the guide and the compass.
Yeah.
The name about the compass and the thing that helps us orient towards north, and it brings up, and you're talking about like the anti-guru-ness of like, don't look at the finger, look where they're pointing. It's an important part with the compass and what that is. So this magnetized stone that is so sought after, the in Spanish piedra imán, right? It's this thing that it putting it on a little floating needle, all of a sudden we have a guarantee of what north is, even during the day or when we can't see the stars specifically. And this orients ourselves in the universe just in having, it's that lighting one candle is better than cursing the darkness. And this is lodestone, right? This is a huge thing. I find lodestone a really beautiful, there's so much amazing lore about it. And it's tying it obviously to the North Star and the various cults of the North Star and the bear ceremonialisms and all these other things that come from that. But that either as the nail of heaven, the great knoll, the kutub, the Saraosha, the Archangel Gabriel that is tied to this star at the top of the world, that the firmament, which is made of iron, is all oriented towards. And this is why it works, is because, and lodestone itself is sympathetic towards the sky that's made of iron, and and Polaris itself as the current reigning champion of northitude. And that, there was this triumphant clasp from the battles of Tuban and the previous stars and what will become Vega in the future, and this understanding of cyclical ownership and time and things like that. But there's something really beautiful I haven't considered. I think, in full transparency, I picked lodestone just because we have a list of things we haven't covered yet, and it's like
right.
And lodestone is not something that I am going to need to like do tons of research off the shows. Like, I don't know anything about lodestone. Like, lodestone's one we work with a lot, and I just mean we in the like royal we, because that's weird.
Well, of course we work with it. Like, one of the things that I was reflecting on, and I definitely want to hear more about the specific star lore, because it does turn up in a lot of those older correspondence tables of working with herb and stone to secure some of the spirits sent forth by a variety of like Pahinian stars, for instance. But I was also just reflecting on how lodestone is the go-to stone that points to magic itself, right? It's the go-to of like natural magicians, like Porter and Newton even, to talk about field-like effects, right? That like this thing is affecting across a distance. And whether or not this was thought to be a physicalist understanding that had already like chucked out the idea of action at a distance or field-like action, held that tiny magnets must be like not invisible, but microscopic magnets, screws must be sent forth to things by magnets to that which is attracted to them to pull them together. That like it was still thought to be an actual, not just an effect of physics, but like a material effect. And it was Newton saying like fields are real. And I'm coming from a deep background in occult philosophy when I say this, right? But also that it's the go-to explanation of not just magic in general or spooky action at a distance, but sympathy and antipathy, the in-breath and out-breath of a naturally magical organic cosmos, right? Yeah. That the magnet also repels other magnets, as well as like bringing things together. Yeah. I even had a note here about like that Insane Clown Posse song, I think it's called Miracles, like has got turned into a meme about like fucking magnets, how do they work? And like, that's like a funny thing to say, but it's also a very traditional question.
Yes. Like hypnotism and magnetism and the whole movement, spiritist movement, are intrinsically tied together.
I was wondering about that. Like animal magnetism and mesmerism and stuff. Like, again, it feels like the quantum. I mean, I guess quantum physics is already real by that point, but it's very much the magicians in the 70s likening everything to quantum. Like it's magicians in the 19th century likening everything to magnetism, using some of the dominant scientific or, again, folkloric understandings of things to try and map what we don't yet know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot with lodestone, obviously, right? Because in the correspondence to the North Star and the guide and the point, and there is a relationship in many, many, many Near Eastern traditions. Like, I mean, like everything from Persian to or esoteric Christianity and Islam and things to the angel Gabriel, and obviously Gabriel being the announcer of the Quran in Islam, and this guide and the rule by which you live and how you do it. But Gabriel is tied to ruh and therefore tied to the breath. So when you mention in and out breath, it's fascinating. And that Jesus, as a prophet, Isa is tied to the breath of God specifically. And this is why he's different as prophets by the time you get to Ibn Arabi, and why is Jesus different than other prophets? And it's because he's an exemplification of breath. And therefore his breath during his lifetime allows him to perform miracles in a way that other prophets didn't even have access to. But without disobeying the will of God, or changing the course of natural things. But that in all of this, whether you go through the Zoroastrian Straosha and like, so you have the Avestan name of the Yasata of conscience and observance that is tied to also to Kutub, tied to the North Star. Little Crowley nod there too of the importance of Kutub in Sufism, and anybody who's 90s influenced traditional witchcraft going through Cult of Sabbatai and other writings that are publicly
available.
A little
Chumblyism there.
Yeah, but the angel of conscience or the voice of conscience, and this tying to the North Star and the tying to lodestone, that the tying to faith, tying to the pointing finger of the guru, that, you know, you look where it points, not at the finger itself, but still the closest you'll know is the actions of the guru. And that in addition to, you have Jesus there as this rule and guide, there is this beautiful washing of lodestone in borderland curanderismo, that, you know, it obviously has a strong place in hoodoo in the American tradition, right, of drawing money or drawing anything, that if you need to attract something or you're building a spirit pot, that lodestone must by nature be added, because that's the ability of the spirit to draw things to its pot or to you intangibly, not just to be able to have hooks and traps, but to be like, no, things that are immaterial must be able to be drawn. You know, some of the earliest written things, I'll come back to the go on this one thing in a minute, but the earliest things of writing of the Sushruta Samhita, talking about magnetite being used to remove arrows and enemy shot metal.
Amazing.
Indian text. So you have this association with healing, and therefore it goes into elf shot and attack from a distance, that you could wash in many folk Catholic traditions a lodestone that is basically like Jesus. And part of that is this, and there's a lot of interesting lore, that you give the lodestone 3 nails, that you are pulling the nails out of Jesus, allowing him to resurrect by your faith, by your action and your commitment to heal people and heal the world. And that in so doing, if you are strong enough in your conviction to do this, that at some point you will be stigmatized, in the sense that the nails will turn on you, and you are now nailed to with Jesus in a forward-backwards paradigm of time, right? Where you are now nailed to the cross with Jesus. And if you see through that, through the powers of the lodestone's ability to remove the pain, or to give you a lenience, that you can survive it because you know it's temporary, but it allows your actions to be met through the metric of the lodestone, meaning the nailing to the cross with Jesus in this way, or by giving the 3 nails in this way, because, you know, the Mexican thing of the you cross the index finger and the thumb to make a mini cross, so that your 3 remaining fingers are the 3 nails. And tied to, you know, you would, your hands are washed in magnet water and some things before you would start doing work, and holy herbs, rosemary, basil, things like that. But in doing so, you are not tempted by lust or by greed, because you have nailed yourself to Christ, that you are sharing the cross with them. So you are unable to engage in certain behaviors because your faith and your conviction are so strong. And then all of this is through a relationship between the nails and the lodestone, which just goes back to so much, right, of like the uncooling nail that is talked about heavily in tradcraft, of just like, it's the fulcrum on which the universe is spinning, this iron dome which everything must pass through, and its relationship to all of the demons that fall, meaning the stars and everything that come down to earth and go below us and above us, and the lightning strike, all these things. I don't know. Lodestone is a very exciting stone.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like you said, like attraction work, not just as like, I would like to, you know, attract the eye of a sexy person, but like the fundamental sympathy of like moves to like, game recognizes game. The words I speak matter. The material I use matter. Is matter. Yeah, absolutely. And then the extra layers of where that goes in terms of pulling out nails. Like, oh my gosh, finding the needle in the haystack. Yeah, with a magnet.
Yeah, absolutely. By the 17th century, because the influence of, I think it was Gilbert, who proposed that the Earth itself was a magnet, and that's why compasses work the way they do, which is, weird, as opposed to Polaris itself being, or a large magnetic island in the North Pole.
Yeah.
That belief that there was an island made of magnets, that this is where, and this is the Hyperborean thing, it gets all merged, and that like the satyrs are all there, and they're all living in this magnet world. But that also, if the Earth is magnet, it's an attractor of life. This is why we are alive here, is because the Earth is magnet, that the magnet is intrinsically tied to our livingness. And the relationship between electricity and magnetism in the early 19th century starts, that's where it's looking, because they're starting to create magnets.
Yeah.
By the time electromagnetism comes around in later. So like looking at all of these ideas of the interconnectedness of that spark of life that is electricity and magnetism, and the forces there that are intrinsically tied to gravity and to discipline and to honesty and to right living, right speech, right deeds, all these things tied into the lodestone, which could be any iron that is now struck by lightning. So it is touched by the heavenly fulgur and, fulgurized iron, and therefore fulgurized rainwater that falls, rain that falls during a thunderstorm during the planetary hour is highly sought after because it's now magnetized towards that planet, and that we can use that to align spell work or a working. It's weird to say spell work. It almost feels like it's like passé to say it now. Like, right? We've adopted a lot of the non-English terms in a lot of the English ways of working, right? Of like to say workings and
mi labores, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and like divine workings, or we drop the spell part. It's very interesting how parlance changes due to proliferation and contact with other systems. Anyway, but all of this is there, right? It's now magnetizing everything to that purpose. It is a way of naming without doing the naming in that way. And therefore, the magnet itself is tied to Adam. There is one story I have heard that there was no magnet in creation, until Adam's death, that a stone was produced that fell out of his mouth when he was praising God.
Oh, wow.
On his death breath, basically. And his death breath coalesced into the first magnet.
Damn.
This was carried as by angels to some place where which we can now all direct ourselves towards a point.
Wow.
Of all drawn. And part of that is that one of the treasures of Golgotha in that way, that perhaps the spear of Longinus is made from that magnet, according to some, which would be really prediction backwards and forwards.
Yep.
But like that's how folklore works. That like somehow part of that magnet had been dispersed throughout different places and everything, and it's kind of like the black stone of the Kaaba coming back to the Kaaba, but that in stabbing the magnet back into Jesus on the tree of Calvary, which then the blood flows down into the soil and down to Adam's skull itself, which turns Adam's breath back to the skull. And therefore, there's this, like, it's just a lovely thing that we're talking about, right? And so the lodestone is the eclipse. The lodestone is the North Star. The lodestone is the divine breath and the friction of God's breath across the face of the waters at the beginning of time, which is Ruh, which is Isa.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just want a little nerdgasm there. But like
that's phenomenal,
hot shit stuff, and then you add in the hammer on top of that. That like we have definite folkloric traces of not only the bear ceremonialism and the bear child and things like that we find, but like Hercules and the club. That the club is actually the same thing as the hammer in a lot of those earlier things. That there's always this strong hero that appears that is of divine origin, that is super strong, and he has something that he whacks things with, and that he himself is the embodiment of that strength of the lodestone, the strength of the North Star.
That's amazing, because like this also, the idea of like Adam's breath cohering into a stone also feels like it's playing on the idea of so many of the teachings of Adam, the books of Adam being recorded in stones, like to explain why he can be the first person to pass the first teacher, but like Enoch is the inventor of writing by many accounts. And the idea that like his teachings were recorded in stones that you could scry. And sometimes that's sapphires or blue stones, but also the concept of the adamanta, of the unbreakable stone.
Yes, that makes. I mean, so the idea that if Adam's breath becomes the lodestone in this way, and Enoch's vision literally becomes writing. Right? There's this. Yeah. There's weird shit there that I've seen the invocation of Enoch's eyeballs, like literally the juice of eyeballs, to be into how you consecrate the pen.
How humorous.
Yeah, how humorous, yes. Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, there's something I don't know. That got really excited, and it's like lodestone. Yeah, don't need to study for this exam. This is a fun one.
There's
Uh,
there's an operation of lodestone in the Supernatural Secrets of the Grimorium Verum, which is with Sergat, and also brings in some a little bit of hagiography as well. In It's an operation to consecrate a lodestone so that you can open locks, and it is said that depending on the manuscript, you trace a St. Andrew's cross over the stone, and then you also, in some manuscripts, use the stone to do it. You trace an X, right, a St. Andrew's cross over the lock with this magnet. Like, so again, these like mixtures of this may well have like opened latches, like very, very literally. Not that all magic has to have a mundane explanation, but that there's this combination of like a practical action to get out of locked things, to be liberated, to escape, as well as to thieve. Let's be honest.
Yeah. There's a lot there, right? You get the conflation in the Beheni, right, where lodestone is the stone given to Al-Qaid, the Great Bear. So this is also the star that in some lists is listed as Polaris. Erroneously, it is felt by many people, but in folk practice ends up being kind of put back to
Right.
Polaris by more than a couple folk exemplars. So Al-Qaid, this star that is in the tail, it's interesting, right? Because we're not talking about Polaris here. We're talking about something different being conflated with it. But even by the use of the lodestone there, it is of course going to just even the fact that it's in the bear, right? To just go for some major in that way. Anyway, I feel like I'm talking so fast I'm gonna make mistakes. I apologize. So you have Al-Qaid in the plow in the big bear being close enough to this idea of the little bear in that way. What else was I gonna say? Oh, lodestone lore of feeding, of how you feed with iron filings and or coins. You have to give it what you want, right? So that if you want love, you have to recite psalms of love and give it things to draw love to you, tokens of love in that way, for everything from body fluids or otherwise. But it's most commonly used for material wealth, of drawing metal.
And this again raises the thing that we've talked about before, about when we are doing a love working and we're burning roses, or we've got rose perfume in the air, or we're like setting out all the materia of love, that there's a model of that this is gathering power, that this is waking up the occult virtue slumbering, and all of these materials, and the ritual is about, stirring the mustard seed, as Agrippa put it. But it's also listing what you want. It's also like breaking down the requests for the spirits that are attracted to that stuff. Like it's again telling them what it is you want. Like, listening to conjure doctors talk about training a lodestone to be able to go out and hunt money for you, or hunt success.
And if it's not working, you need to see about a different lodestone, and maybe that lodestone is not mated to you, or it's not mated to the cause that you've given it. And similarly, the feeding of the lodestone with filings is the whole thing of like feeding the magnet within curanderismo. Like, you do feed it filings, but it is still about, these are the good deeds that you're feeding it, right? These that, like, in order to feed this celestial lodestone that is the breath of Adam, you must feed it with other things, or it will not draw things to you. And in that same like alchemical way, you have to have gold to make gold, so it must start with something, and it goes from there. So yeah, there's something there in the whole comparison too, that like the lodestone is wonderfully applicable to Sterling in that way then, right? Of like,
draws the other spirits.
For you. It's just pointing the way. And by which you can orient yourself to understand what stars you're looking at.
Well, one of the arguments for Skerlin's character may be emerging from a circle. I mean, like a thing that you carve on the ground and stand inside to summon and do your work, in spite of the fact that it's a diamond shape. But it has the names of the compass points around it, Orient, Septentrion, etc. Like, it is literally a compass. Yeah,
it's interesting.
I love it when a plan comes together.
Okay, so on that note, Hopses.
All right, I've got an Adamic context that could thread this together on our Golgothian thing. So the hops are supposed to turn green on Christmas Eve. This is the Feast of Adam and Eve for a start, but it's even more linked to it because it is the sign that you look for in a bunch of the folkloric beliefs that on Christmas Eve, animals receive the gift of speech, specifically like the night of Christmas Eve. And so this idea of the animals that were surrounding the manger, right? Like there's that context for it. So the adoration, but also the animals of Eden that were able to, speak freely and in peace, which I was like, oh, that's neat.
Yeah. That is quite fascinating. Hops, right, is used heavily for sleepy stuff because that's its phytochemical relationship, is that it does kind of make us sleepy. It is related to both pot and nettle. By pot, I mean disrespectfully mota and marijuana. So this idea that it grows like a wolf among sheep,
wild among the willows, right?
Yeah. That's fascinating. So that hops itself has this relationship, a German relationship to hops and beer making. It's just flavoring many things.
And it's a way of preserving as well as flavoring, right? That before hops were used, the way you kept beer longer was to make it stronger, to make it more alcoholic. And so with the addition of the preservative of hops, it means that you can have beer that's weaker but will still keep longer.
Yeah,
there's
the war.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of war between Gruit and hopped beer, between the heavy Hamburg beer, which is hopped, and the foreign beer wars and other things in this. It's fascinating. Are there hops or there not hops in this? Are there herbs in this or there not herbs in this? And the difference between like heavily botanical saturated alcohols, which might include hops for that, and the wordplay that you see in some folk charms of hops and hope is interesting. Just reminds me of like even the Franklin quote of expanding hops to be so metonymic of beer, I guess, but of that beer is proof that God exists and wants us to be happy.
Right.
And
right.
It's also that hopped beer, of course, is beer has been sterilized and it's safe to drink. So in areas where the water's bad, this hopped thing becomes this symbol of hope, literally, of like, you can drink this.
Yep.
It's the stronger beer was, the longer it kept, but when you add hops, it's actually what you can give it without falling into inebriation.
Yep.
So hops becomes this symbol of divinity and this idea of piety and it's interesting that it goes green on Christmas Eve. It kind of returns us back to this state where like, well, this is the only thing we can drink. And it's hops that allows us to have this without falling into inebriation.
Yeah. I think of the 18th century temperance movement in the UK. Before temperance of like no drop of alcohol shall pass these lips. There's two very famous engravings, which are, I want to say, Gin Alley and Beer Street. And it's basically showing that like the preponderance of the English to just like guzzle gin by the bathload produces, it's an image of like, social carnage. It's a conservative's wet dream of like, mothers puking into open gutters and like babies running around like holding knives to old ladies and stuff. And that's the devilish work of drinking something that's too inebriating. And beer is seen as this is the responsible choice. Look how the society flourishes on Beer Street. Look at how everyone is nice to each other and doesn't go beyond their means. No one is throwing up anywhere. And so before there was no alcohol emphasis, there was a like, well, you can still have a beer or two. Like, don't be daft about it. Like, I find that an interesting context.
You would, as your ancestry betrays you. And I don't think it's fair to just call you a Brit because I know you have so much Irish background too. But for those who are like me, or just if you're not aware of the massive amounts of beer that the average British person can consume, especially when there is a foreigner visiting with them, I have committed the cardinal offense of falling asleep in a pub, because I'll fall asleep anywhere. But it's 6 or 7 rounds in and they keep going. It's like, I've had more cider in the past half hour, or like beer often, that it's just because they're trying to be nice. And I will buy the rounds, but there are pints lining up by me. And I was like, please drink these. Like, I cannot keep up. And it's just so much to drink. And then beer is associated. It's going to take me a second to remember it, but the Shakespeare quote of alcohol and piss. But
that it's not bought so much as rented. Is that Shakespeare?
No, it's Macduff in Macbeth. This says something like, what 3 things does drink especially provoke? And it's, nose painting, sleep, and urine.
That's the porter, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, he's talking with the porter. It's after the murder is committed. And the porter is doing the, knocks her and goes off on the whole thing. And you have this comic relief right after such a big cathartic moment of if it were done when 'tis done. So anyway, I associate, it was kind of tongue in cheek, yes, to bring hop to this, but my whole memory and I hope we're not betraying anything terrible, but it was a lovely night. That first Museum of Witchcraft conference that I went to you with. I don't know if you'd been before then to the conference. I know you've been to the museum, but being in the museum after hours with Jake
Mm.
in that one downstairs room was such an interesting thing because there was a lot of beer before that.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of conversation, but it was I don't associate beer with generosity except on my British trips, which is kind of funny. And a large part that's due to being with you, and pubs have a certain lovely charm, and I think even on the website we use a picture of us in one of the
At the Fleece, yeah, one of the oldest continually running pubs in
and we
at
still
least in the UK.
Still have a hope of maybe doing a pub tour in the UK at some point.
That would be amazing, yeah.
Just take time off and go to pubs and record episodes. But yeah, again, here's to you, Jake. Like I'm a hard alcohol person when I am a drinker, but and unfortunately, when you're not a drinker anymore, a little bit of hard alcohol goes a long way. So it's a cheap day.
Oh yeah, the rum had been cracked out by that point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, that was really wonderful. Yeah.
And beer itself is such a fascinating thing, as the extension of hops there. Not that all beer is hopped, but that beer is generally like considered the tool of civilization, and like Hathor and Oshun, like that's who beer belongs to in the Orisha community. It's like this camaraderie and community, and like how it keeps things flowing. And it's the not poisoned water. Again, in many things, it's like don't drink the water in Mexico, drink the beer. And how the beer of a country will always be suited to its cuisine. Anyway, hops is interesting. Sleepiness as part of it, but also preservation, hope, preservation, perhaps.
Faith, hops, and charity.
Yeah, exactly. So where do you see all of this tying into? I mean, the devil card is such an easy. I'm not gonna. It's fascinating because I put the devil because I don't. Frankly, I wouldn't put. I think it would be interesting to explore the magician as the fool in contrast, but the devil is interesting in relationship to the Grimorium Verum and this and even beer or otherwise. But lodestone being so associated with virtue, it's fascinating to then put it like the devil being the voluntary servitude of things. That if you know that you're serving something or you're bound to something, that can be voluntary servitude towards something to achieve an aim that you can then release yourself from is one thing. Voluntary servitude towards something that it becomes involuntary through codependency or not being able to, abuse or otherwise is a whole other thing. So I think any book of demonic magic and the devil card obviously make a certain Capricornic sense, right? There's like this best practices laid out, and people have, I think in many ways, one of the things that can happen with the folkization of anything, like, and even this repaganization or an understanding of the paganization of grimoires through the Grimorium Verum type of thing, or the survival of, because it's none of that is making the right directional sense, but that the dehorning of demons does take place, and that sometimes this is okay, like sure. You can do that, but it can still headbutt you. And there's something to that I think one of the conversations, I remember the last big conversation with Jake that we were talking about the consequences of, the fuck around and find out that happens. And certainly every magician will have stories about the fuck around and find out part, either through personal stories of friends around them or their own personal stories that they've, survived through.
Yeah.
And this is one of the telltales of demonic magic, right? Of working with demons, that there are sometimes grimoire fail-safes are a little bit overkill. Sometimes they're rooted in a very specific cosmology that is very distasteful to many of us.
Right.
Or a technology that might seem a little bit cosmologically formidable that is distasteful. But at the same time, acknowledging if we're going to do folk necromancy, then we also have to do the folking of our results. That I remember there was that great short story in one of, I think it was Lon-Milo Duquette's My Life with the Spirits, where he talks about the invocation of Orobas, and suddenly the impulse and the gambling and this different thinking about things is like spirits don't always manifest results or manifest corporeally in the way that we think, and that their expression in matter is also limited to, yes, their sympathy and their understanding or how they move through the world, their own lodestones, if you will. They can only draw a like type of iron filing. Wow, that's a That's some metaphor. But we also have to realize where those things play out in our own lives in a way that is important to understand that we may ask for something, and the invocation of that demon, by in part, we are asking for our lives to be changed by that demon's inclusion in our life.
Yeah.
And that there are consequences to that are the properties of our actions from the beginning. They're not good or bad. They are just part of it. And part of understanding demonic magic and the overemphasis, perhaps rightly so sometimes, of like miasmic influence or contagion, and to understand stratification and how to work best in these ways. Stratification is hilarious with Stratton-Kent. Just to understand best practices of how to get out of the funk that can happen, or how to understand the melancholia that will build with every sorcerer's practice, of how do you get out of that. And we have cross-cultural comparisons of like, being, drenched by the Kalunga, as we might say, and how to tidy up to be like, okay, fairy queens are all fine and dandy in the woods, but they don't belong in my house. And that's not a condemnation of fairy. It's understanding how fairy works. That like the majority of people's, working with fairy is like, do not bring this back into the house. No. I need crosses and metal. The butter and milk offerings go outside or in the kitchen, maybe, because they're going to come down the chimney no matter what, but keep them in the fucking kitchen. And so again, I think there's that one deck by, is it the Supra deck that Usi did that is really beautiful, looking at like Jungian archetypes, but their one of demon is a chained pair of hands with water pouring over them.
Oh.
And there's something really telling of that. And I think that the devil card speaks to that bondage and to that understanding of we must constantly weigh with ourselves. And again, like talking about the difference between self-intellectualization versus self-awareness.
Yeah.
And what those are, of like not just the reasons why something is happening to us, the demon or us or whatever it is, but what is it that you need and what can you do to move through it? Oftentimes, and I think it makes me think about divination and how when I have clients coming to me or godchildren, sometimes I don't care who sent the curse. I just don't. I want to know how to remove it from the person.
Yeah.
Like it's not helpful necessarily to start this back and forth, like let's kill the person that goes, that it will taint you. This is the revenge part as being a seed that can taint you. It can really work its way in when you want to talk about demon and devil.
Yeah.
And like just how can we get back to a neutral place of health? I was moved recently by my god sister Ingrid posting about how she has someone who's going into her DMs, lighting up her DMs with like criticizing and condemning her and all these other things. And she's like, I truly wish for my enemies to be happy. You know why? Because when someone is happy, they are thinking about travel and food and fucking and leaving me alone. So happiness for you, enemy. Happiness for you, enemy. Just a lovely, fantastic way to turn that. Like,
kill them with kindness. Yeah.
It's not just I wish you a long life because you will suffer greatly during this. I wish you a long life of happiness. Be happy. Go over there.
Right. Of massively distracting happiness. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, I love that. Yeah.
That distancing might be something to tie even an Albus in, and Albus is not necessarily the figure I'd think of with Jake. At the same time, why not?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's earlier stuff we talked about with, citing one's lineages and sources, not to flex academia over someone, right? And again, that was something that was, Jake was an autodidact who I think left school at 14, and that was vehemently part of his, sense that you don't necessarily understand something better just by using fancier words, right? But gosh, I've been lucky enough to work on one of his last works that's coming out through the Hadians, the second volume in the Night School series, the Terrestrial Intelligencer, and he fought very hard against footnotes for a very long time as distracting you or as like aping, some of the worst parts of academia that he didn't feel he needed to engage with, but that these can be very helpful as well when we're talking about. Where are we coming from? What are we working with? Who are the magicians that came before us that we honor? And so that sense of that the past is not inert, and while we aren't our ancestors, we can still learn things from them.
Yeah.
I would also say there's one thing, and I may have mentioned this before, but it continues to be something that I chew on in the wee small hours, which is that Like Albus, for me is very much a figure of the calming wisdom of the wise dead, of the yellowing of the scrolls, of the body of work of our hashtag dead magicians. Everyone take a drink. But in Albus Moors, in its place in the 8th house when it turns up, in the house of death and the dead and activating spirits and the witchcraft that we do, there's actually a summarization of it by Christopher Catan, who says that in all demands of this house, this figure is good, except for nigromancy and diabolical arts, in which it is ill, unless it be to make men sing and dance. And this ill seems to connote a lack of cess of the magical endeavor rather than causing ill effects. But the idea that there is still amity, there is still a collegiate sympathy of the white one that's not suited to bilious, hateful curse work. It's very much the white flag. It's a figure that is a pacifist. It speaks of peace an awful lot. But this idea that like peace is also maintained in the place of darkest, spooky spirits, that Albus can also, it's not encouraged to try and think that we can summarize all of the wisdom of that, but it can be helpful to make men sing and dance. Like this idea that like we get to be excited about the stuff once we've footnoted it, and we get to talk about it, and we get to be in community, and we get to, there's joy in the passions that we follow responsibly. It's not just about, being a cold, logical Vulcan about things. It's about being, in Jake's case, a devotee of Vulcan Hephaestus, right? Of the fire that you tend, of the metal that you continue to work, of the hammering away at something, and of the way that percussion can be something you can dance to too.
That's fascinating. I think there's a lot there with that corresponding, and again, my normal caveat, blah, 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 of we're talking about one of the higher Odu in Ifa, and by higher I just mean in the cross comparison between shell casting and Ifa, which is Okbwele or Hermit divination. The corresponding Odus are 13, 14, 15, 16 are often not read in De Lagoon. In the Cuban system and in the traditional systems in Brazil they did, because the Ifa came so much later. Mm-hmm. But Oturukon or 14 shells, Merinla, there's a proverb that one hand cannot clap, one leg cannot walk quickly. Quickly, mind you. One leg cannot walk quickly. And so that it's a call for society, for socialization, for people to come together and celebrate individual successes, but especially communal successes. And it specifically talks about minors joining with elders in order to learn what was best and then move forward, as opposed to condemn the elders for their mistakes.
That's beautiful.
And it's interesting with that in talking about footnotes is because I love this. There was a lot of discussion of footnotes specifically and the difference between footnotes and endnotes, and like breaking of the spine and things like that happens, mm-hmm. like what's the desired thing from a publisher, mm-hmm. but the choreography of the eye across the page, and that grounding yourself in what has been referenced outside the book also trains the person to ground themselves in things outside their own experience. And that's a fascinating, instead of just being self-referential, it is interesting that footnotes, and I'm not going to say it's a sign of growth, it's a sign of a different way of approach. No matter what it is, just because it is what it is. And this idea of the academic urge to, you get one original thought and you get, 240 pages to prove it. And probably half of those pages are footnotes. So it's just, there's something interesting in that, in comparing it to Albus and this, the white hermit that is delicate, is a fascinating something. My words are terrible.
Yeah, that study is inherently melancholic, as calling, like we said, calling unclean spirits. That's why they're unclean, right? They're going to get gunk everywhere. But the idea that the wise dead encourage the living to live, right? And to enjoy life is, even in this most sort of fastidious and quiet in the library sign, is, I think, really beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's your bookmark for one thing, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I made Albus bookmarks. Yeah. I put them in mail outs of commissions, like talismans and stuff I make for people. Yeah. If you're going to need bookmarks, you might as well have them, enchanted to be able to remember what you've been reading and to improve alacrity of thought and, banish brain fog and stuff like that.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other things with 14 shells. Although you've lost the battle, you've won the war. Hot winds bring death, or hot winds bring disease. It's just, there's this notion of predicting by what's happening and what's happened before that is referenced in this sign.
Right. Empirical learning. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also, things come suddenly, so you will miss your opportunity if you're not prepared by listening to those around you who have more experience. I think this is one of the ones where they have the cat comes to earth in this sign. And which is a funny thing because, Albus and the cat don't necessarily come to sense, but it's because the cat is a weak creature in heaven and goes for divination. And we know that part of Aoife's self-referential, reverential tactic is to praise how important it is to go for divination.
Yes.
But the cat goes for divination and is told that it has to make sacrifice with a knife and a scissors and like a pigeon and a rooster and all these things. And all of these things come out into how the cat can incorporate. But the pain, in order to manifest, the cunning and the stealth and the tracking of game that happens there is all born in this sign too, that it's the best and the worst of cats. This like social, like a cat that is social, we actually can trust, like our cat, we can trust, but we can't trust other cats. So it's this for like to create a community around that. And then the long, sharp claws that, that are dangerous, extremely dangerous, and yet it can catch prey and it can protect. But it's this emphasis on like it's an irate, weird little personality is in the sign, and we think of the hermitude of cats in there. And I think that story is reflected publicly in Oceanileles de Logumbuk, Stuart's book. And I'm not saying that like this is how you interpret these things again, but again, public force of things. I've said the word again. You should take a shot when I say the word again. And I'm going to piss off elders. But yeah, so my apologies if I misquoted anything there. But it's an interesting sign, and I think if we're going to take the hermitude of the cat as a lesson here, there's something quite interesting there, and the emphasis, the community, and you got to work with that cat when it's young to make sure it realizes whose house it belongs to.
Yes. Which
is kind of a breaking of spirit in some ways, or it's the trading of something so that there's longer benefits in the end. And what does that mean? Is it a yoke around the ox, or is it the chain around the baby elephant's ankles so that when it's an adult it doesn't realize it can rip away? I don't know. But all those things would be considered in something like this, right? Of like, what do you have to do to restrain the character so that the character is proven and grows to be of benefit to the person and the community, as opposed to self-destructive and destructive to the community. The difficulties of life, that if you have this type of personality in here, you will have powerful enemies, and you have to rise above that. But you rise above that through discipline, and you rise above that through taking the temperature and allowing yourself to learn from other mistakes, because the things that will happen in your life are so big that you will not have time to learn. You will have to learn to be like the Matrix and dodge the bullets in those ways. Anyway,
learning on the job.
Yeah, learning. My learning curve is very specific.
It's more like just a plate of spaghetti.
My learning curve is, yes, it's either a giant spaghetti monster or it's just running the opposite direction. So, okay, and here in all seriousness, like, our dead magician who we've been talking about throughout is Jake Stratton-Kent, who I've shared a little bit, but I would really love, without, begging anything stupid or forced, but I know that you, Al, have had a very long friendship with Jake, and I think I'm going to cede to you. I will say that he taught me a lot about what it is to be actually interested in dialogue and in knowledge and the practice of that search. He was incredibly punk in that way. And he was one of the few people ever that when someone violently tried to disagree with him, he wasn't responding in rage. He was like, let's talk, let's go. And it was very few people seemed to take him up on that opportunity that he very much wanted. And so if nothing else, I hope to learn from that. There's a certain type of thing that when you're pursuing knowledge and you want that knowledge to be out there and to be explored, you don't care who's researching it. It doesn't have to be you. And if somebody else has researched it, great. You don't have to research that part of it. You can read that and form your own opinion and then fill in the holes. And I think that speaks to a certain community and body of knowledge that is, if we're going to talk about building the immaterial, there's Jake was definitely a lodestone. That said, I'm going to shut up and just talk about your friend, and if that's not so bold to say.
No, not at all. No, those who are not dead that have their name still spoken, right? And as Jake was fond of saying, necromancy never truly dies, right? I had that real sense in writing this foreword that Urs asked me to do for his one of his last books that's coming out at some point soon. That this was it was a summation of so much of his work. It's it was the terrestrial intelligence. He was attempting to do a 21st century conjure primer, is how he put it. And so there is a summation of an awful lot of his work, his his championing of the importance of the sublunary spheres, including the underworld, the in-depth analysis he did of appearances of spirits across the Grimoire corpus, talking about aliases, his concept of like the duplicates or ghosts, as well as like, again, charting the interrelationality. There's so much stuff we could say about his work, but he was a tremendous friend and influence on just looking at like my own personal practice and my own personal life in terms of, I got to properly talk to him at one of the occult conferences. I can't remember which one it was exactly. And we, hit it off and went for a beer, obviously, and like chatted about stuff. And, at that point I was starting to work with some grimoires. Some of the earliest things that I got into was not just reading Crowley and thinking about it, but actually trying to do stuff. And his championing of Verum, of like, hey, maybe try this thing, which was there was no like, there was no gurudom, there was no like my grimoire's better than other people's, but a genuine sense of like, this could be something useful for you. And in getting to go for drinks with him and with like mutual friends and just talk about this stuff, not in a formal context, but in the sense of like how this played out in my life. It was through the pacts that I made with the Verum spirits I still work with that Kimbanda even came on my radar at all, that it brought me to listening to more people, trying to learn more things. One of the many things that that spurred our friendship, right, was reaching out and wanting to know more about this and coming up and seeing what it was about and talking about it and seeing how that worked and revising a lot of my perspectives on what magic was meant to be and what ritual looked like and how we work and stuff. And Kimbanda is now like such a rich and deep part of my practice now. And I'm really grateful to Jake and to you and to so many other people along the way. Again, I don't mean to say this in terms of like, and that's why I'm like, and that's why I'm the great magus I am today. But like, I credit where it's due. Like, give footnote our lineages of thought and influence and the friends along the way that we got to share time with, and to see the spark of brilliance in them and their willingness to share that with other people. It's incredibly meaningful to me. And I know I'm not the only one. He was so generous with his time and his correspondence. So many people when he passed were like, I'm so sad we never got to meet in person, but I cherish the correspondence we had, the sharing of so many like, punk songs on YouTube and stuff, as well as like, check out this grimoire, as well as like, let's have a debate about that, There's so many things I could say, and so many times I've been, I keep saying grateful, but so grateful, stumbling on my words a little bit now. Again, like the so many influences of ideas around like we've talked about, that there is an element of like the folk in folk necromancy is also a little bit about punk necromancy. And I think a lot about, his quotes around, don't wait until you know before you start, because you'll never start. Make mistakes, get your fingers burned, never mind what other people say, they don't know. Experiment, get back to the old punk rock ethos, start with 3 chords. It will get better as you go along, That's been a compass point for me, and continuing to try and to turn up and to turn up until I feel ready, rather than trying to wait to turn up till when I feel ready, And again, the emphasis on community and on talking about this and on not being content to just let it be fun ideas that we get to debate in the abstract, but things we get to live. So here's very much to you, Jakey. Born 27th of April 1956 and passed on the 17th of January 2023.
I think it's worth exploring why it is we, in addition to, yes, we belong to traditions that say to wait a year before really speaking of the dead, unless you are obviously doing memorials and things like that. But part of it, the importance of allowing the person to start the ancestralization process, if that's what's happening metaphysically, but that when that person dies, death is attached to their death. I know that sounds really weird, but death is attached to their dying act. Death has to go away still.
Right, it has a virtue and a state of its own. And
for those of us in a Congolese informed worldview, sunset and midnight sun are not the same thing.
Mm.
To quickly refer to someone as ancestor doesn't allow them to pass.
Right. Moving house is stressful, right? and yeah, moving to the other side is probably best that you're not bothering them too much while they're still, unpacking and working out what they want to do with their true will and the universe, right?
Yeah. And it also doesn't make it about us.
Mm.
If we wait, it allows what needs to be for them to be for them. You take care of the rights and these things, but to come back, there are many saints who perform miracles in their lifetime, folk saint and official, but they still are proven through beatification and blessedness later and achieve canonization. And even in the pre-congregation era, like, things are proven through their efficacy. And even I remember having a conversation with Jake, because online he once posted that Cyprian was a folk saint, and that was my immediate, he was like, Jake, no, he's actually a very official saint, but has folk Catholicism, folk magic applied to him. So he is being engaged with through folk Catholicism and folk Christianity. But that is a different thing than being a folk saint, which is, unofficial. In the same way that there are saints that have, their lives are already filled with miracles, and the legacy that they have is already set. I'm not trying to, I think it's always weird to make quote unquote folk saints of people in that way. But we are believers in the mighty dead for sure. And in, Al Dead Magician's Cummins. And your work and exploration into the excellent art of the Book of Magic. Am I saying that title right? Wow.
The Excellent Book of the Art of Magic, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Excellent Book of the Art of Magic. And the calling upon your future perfected self and calling upon magicians is a wonderful cheat. And there's some part of that way that's like, it's even in the phrase of like, what would Jesus do? Is like, what, I'm sure there are going to be times for the people that knew him, like, what would Jake say to this? And also pull you out of the calcification of opinion, because that's one of his strong points. But what that is, the legacy that's there is not just because of what's in print. There's something there, but he would never want those words to be used as like their jumping off place for him always. And then despite the criticism I've seen in the past while he was alive, even, of people saying it's armchair magic, or why are we debating about the origin of these names and stuff? Because people are actually doing the magic. There are people that do that instead of doing the magic. But Jake was actually trying to do the magic and to do that. Yeah. It was his lived path at that point. Just because someone is interested in researching those things doesn't mean that they are not doing the work. And, I can criticize his aesthetic. I could criticize...
You don't want skulls and leopard print on everything? How dare you?
Well, no, actually, the personal aesthetic I was cool with. But, like, go look at the spirit pots that are at the Museum of Witchcraft. Like, they're pretty, they're functional, but they're not, like, outstandingly showy in any way.
They're not designed to impress anyone else, yeah.
Yeah, and I should say, one could criticize the aesthetic of those pots, but the proof would be in the folking of it. And I think with Jake, unabashedly would associate folking with queering in the way of like, fuck it all up. It all up. And as someone who both loves tradition and despises it, like, and going back to that Mahler quote, Jake lived that very fully. And if things need to die, let them die. They'll be resurrected anyway because we're necromancers. And sometimes we're waiting around in any discipline for the older people that have stated their opinions to die so that things can move forward. We rarely find people who were moving it forward by allowing their own opinions and calcifications to die in their lifetime. Yeah. And Jake was an excellent exemplar of that. And I applaud him. And if nothing else, if the cult of Saint Jake arises, whatever form, unofficial, Gnostic or otherwise, that I hope he continues to scratch at the edification without exploration, without, the theory without practice bullshit. Yeah. Someone who could dedicate his life towards English Kabbalah and then throw it all out, right?
Right.
And always be willing to drink with people that are yelling at you. And
haters go and raise some valid points, right?
Yeah, and to make the extremely vibrant point that neon always goes with black, and that black always goes with animal print. So all of those things.
Yeah.
So here's to you, Jake, and I hope to have further conversations with you, but maybe with less beer involved for me personally. I hereby bequeath whatever beer I was supposed to drink in this lifetime to Jake. But yeah.
No, that's lovely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was a little trepidatious as I was for the panel about, how do you don't set yourself up to succeed by trying to summarize the life of someone who was like, so vibrant and passionate and such a rabble rouser, but we get to keep remembering and we get to keep talking and reflecting, and that's important in of itself, I think. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, the relationship to what ancestralization is both mitigated by the people that reach out to that ancestor or that ancestor appears to, but it also is filtered through a need of the time and the context of the time which that ancestor occurs. But not only their own timestamp, but as mythologization happens, which I don't think is fictionalization, is, the movement from small t to from a truth to capital T truth, or just, non-exclusive truth, let's say, that the needs are met through that force, and that is, and I really applaud there is a discussion that, like, okay, in palmistry, right, the children lines could be things that outlive you, like books, and like, that's cute. Yes, it is. For Jake, they really were his children. And there are certain people that have had so much thought from those that they are that's the spiritual lineage. And oftentimes in the Western tradition, we mistake, as you talked about, and I'm gonna hone in on it more. We mistake knowledge as, transactory, and it's over commoditized, and we can quote other people and not give them attribution and try and make it seem like it's our knowledge when we don't know that knowledge itself is a relationship. And as you were talking about the grimoires earlier, that putting these spirits in a relationality with the world around us through the folking of necromancy, through the queering of necromancy, through the jaking of necromancy, that there is something that is intrinsically about co-locating yourself in the landscape around you and allowing knowledge to be the bridge and the conversation with which it is constantly tested through our daily actions, character, relationships, and otherwise. So these demons are literally the exchange of breath between us and the outside world, that, one skull can then be the repository of Skirlin's, I will call the other ones for you type of thing. I will be Adam and name them for you. I will be the lodestone that draws, that attracts what you seek to your life. And I that's anything that gets us back into relationality, even if it's in a small circle of care for the land you're on, care for the community that you're a part of, even if that's you and your cat. Like, what is that to not just constantly, the benefit of the choreography of the eye and the grounding of yourself in the footnotes of your life, right? Like, how do you not cheat yourself out of relationship to the world around you, as opposed to arguing or explaining or over intellectualizing instead of awareness on that track?
Yeah. How do we get to be the intermediary for our own circumstances and contexts and our own passions? And how do we get to find the useful things to kick against and not be bound by the devil of reactionary defiance, right? How do we fight for things, not just against stuff?
Yeah. Baal Serlin Genium Domus. Yeah.
Potent spirits. Yeah.
So I guess with that, we've kind of drawn to its natural close.
Yeah.
I think, right? We hit things. We hit everything.
We hit all our themes. Yeah. This has been great. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing this breath with me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Always. It's ironic because we see it. We saw each other in person recently. We'll see each other again in person, and we still have to record over Zoom.
Yep.
Zoom is the modern day Serlin, or an expression of Serlinitude. Zoom. Anyway, thank you again, everyone, for listening, for joining us on this January, we'll just call it our 7th anniversary episode, and the 1-year anniversary of Jake's passing. But yeah, go fuck shit up, everybody. Have fun. Happy 2024, and may Golgothiel and all of the demons be in exchange with the world around you to enrich it. So here's to RFG, here's to Jake, here's to 2024, and thank you, Al.
Cheers. Thank you, Jesse. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this one, if you've got to this far. Hoping for lots more episodes to come on all sorts of things, and some more experimentations with how we can provide more material and like things like that. The ideas are still percolating and distilling for something like a Patreon along the way, and really excited to find more ways to support and enrich the community of you guys listening. So thank you very much.
Feel free to check out radiofreegolgotha.com, which will be the place where we update not only episodes, but current talks or lectures or classes that either Al or I are giving, or at the same time, maybe.
We've got some conference appearances, both of us, at some of our favorites and some new ones as well over the year. So we'll be updating that as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. There's also a subsection on there, or you can also look at speakeasyofthedead.com as a reference to there. Our kind of fancy cabaret, online cabaret for fancy necromancers is what Al said. I'm bad with where the adjective goes. But this is, we'll be doing hopefully a few this year, but this is more of a group informal thing. And as always, we have the forum on Facebook, but again, radiofreegolgotha.com will have our updates and our various red threads through the labyrinth from there.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.